Well, it's so exciting to see a full room, and I know the overflow room upstairs is also filled on what is probably the snowiest day of the year in Cleveland. And I know there's a lot of excitement and buzz. I could feel it when I entered into the room. Sorry we started a little bit late. We have some snow issues, but this gave everybody an opportunity to get here. We have to end, however, right at 5:30 because our speaker today has a flight that he's hoping to catch if the airport stays open. Well, for those of you who may be watching this on the webcast and don't know me and aren't one of the students in my classes, I'm Professor Michael Scharf, the director of the Frederick K. Cox International Law Center here at Case Western Reserve University School of Law. The Cox Center was founded in 1991 with a $2 million endowment by the Gun Foundation. And since that time, it has grown such that one half of our faculty teach international law-related courses. We have 46 courses in all in the international specialty. We have a summer abroad program in Utrecht. We have a Cayman Islands spring break program that sounds exotic, but it actually teaches about offshore banking. We have 5 different labs where our students are doing work for war crimes tribunals, for Congress, for the military commissions, for the IMF and World Bank. And we have an immigration law practicum. Over 50% of our entering students this year said that they came to this law school because of its international law program, and we're very excited about all of the offerings and the speakers and the internships and the conferences we've been able to provide for them. Well, part of the Cox Center is called the Klatsky. The Klatsky has an internship at Human Rights Watch and an endowed lectureship, which is what you're going to see today. The Klatsky is named after an alumnus of this law school and the university, Bruce Klatsky, who was then the CEO of Phillips Van Heusen Corporation. And in 2001, just 6 years ago, he gave us a nice $300,000 endowment to create this lectureship. The past speakers who have spoken under this endowed lecture have included Harold Koh, now Dean of Yale Law School, who was at the time leaving the State Department as Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights, David Crane, the prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone, Eli Rosenbaum, the director of the Department of Justice's Office of Special Investigations, and Samantha Power, who that year won the Pulitzer for her book on genocide. And we're very happy to add one more great lecturer to that list. You will hear the introduction to that lecturer by our own dean, Gary Simpson, who has joined us about 8 months ago. He graduated from Yale Law School. He clerked on the Second Circuit Federal Court of Appeals. He started his academic career at University of Texas, then went on to Cornell, where he became the associate dean, and we stole him away to have him as our leader. He's also, for international law purposes, in a very exciting element of his resume, he is the leading author of the book on conflicts of law, which is now in its 4th edition and is used throughout the world. And he's been a huge support and given us much guidance in our international law program. So please join me in a warm welcome for our Dean, Gary Simpson.
I have to add, it's easy to be the dean of a school that have people like Michael Scharf. It's our privilege today, as Michael said, to have Kenneth Roth as our 2007 Klatsky Seminar lecturer. He's an internationally recognized leader in defense of human rights. He's been here before, in fact, I think October, and we look forward to having him here many more times in the future. He is the leader of Human Rights Watch, which is the largest human rights organization and based in the United States. His work has had an enormous impact on issues of justice and accountability for human rights violations in more than 70 countries. Human Rights Watch investigates, reports on, and seeks to curb human rights violations. He came to human rights with an enormous resume in terms of professional and personal experience. He's been its executive director since 1993, and prior to that had been its deputy director. Before that, he was a federal prosecutor in the Southern District of New York, and for the Iran-Contra investigation in Washington, D.C. He's also worked in private practice as a litigator. His interest in human rights arose in part because of his father's experience fleeing Nazi Germany in 1938. Mr. Roth began working on human rights after the declaration of martial law in Poland in 1981, and soon after that became deeply engaged in fighting military repression in Haiti. In nearly 14 years now as Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, the organization has quadrupled in size and its geographic reach has expanded enormously as well. It's added special programs devoted to refugees, children's rights, international justice, AIDS, gay and lesbian rights, human rights emergencies, terrorism and counterterrorism, and the human rights responsibilities of multinational corporations. He'll speak to you today about global human rights leadership, who will fill the void left by the United States. As I'm sure you're aware, this is the 5th anniversary of the establishment of the Guantanamo Bay, Cuba Detention Center. This has gotten a lot of press. And Human Rights Watch has called on the Bush administration very clearly to bring criminal charges or else release the nearly 400 detainees, restore their access to federal court. I'm sure Mr. Roth is going to go into that in some detail. He'll speak for about 30 minutes, then take some questions. At that time, I'll ask you to wait for a microphone. I think there are 2 coming around. And there will be a reception, though I'm not sure how much time Mr. Roth will have to be there with us because of his plane. Again, we're really very privileged to have him here, truly one of the leading people in the world in terms of human rights. So let me welcome now Mr. Roth.
Well, thanks very much, Dean Simpson. It's a pleasure to be here. I thought I would just begin with a word about Bruce Klatsky, because usually, these names of these lectures are just abstractions and nobody knows who these people are. Bruce happens to be a close friend of mine. He's the vice chair at this point of Human Rights Watch. And I thought I would just tell you a story about his somewhat inauspicious beginning in the human rights field. Because at the time, Bruce was the CEO of Philips Van Heusen, as was mentioned, which is a shirt manufacturer. And it had a plant in Guatemala, which was in the middle of a fairly intense labor dispute with a group that was trying to unionize. We had convinced Bruce to be the chair of our annual fundraising dinner in New York. And he showed up at the Museum of Natural History where we held it, and outside was a giant 5-story rat that the labor unions, blow up to sort of say, you're being a rat, you're being anti-union. And so this was, his welcome to the human rights movement. Fortunately, Bruce, being a stand-up guy, fixed the problem in Guatemala. They actually recognized the first labor union in the industry, and he's been, he's kind of lived by his principles ever since. So we got past that, but it was not the most auspicious beginning to his human rights involvement. Anyway, we're starting a little late, so I will try to speak quickly because I'd like to kind of maximize time for Q&A, which I find more interesting than my just lecturing. But I thought I would describe a genuine problem that we're grappling with these days as we try to protect human rights around the world. I think many of you know that Human Rights Watch basically relies on shaming. We investigate human rights abuses, we expose them to public scrutiny, and because everybody is embarrassed to have their human rights abuses exposed, this tends to push them to be more respectful of human rights. But in case they don't get the message by having the spotlight shined on their abuses, we also go to powerful governments and institutions around the world and ask them to use their diplomatic or their economic clout to, kind of arm twist the government into better respect for human rights. Now, traditionally, we have relied to a large degree on the U.S. government. It's obviously the most powerful government around. It has a foreign policy that, since the days of Jimmy Carter, is at least theoretically committed to the promotion of human rights. So it is a natural ally/target for these kind of advocacy efforts. The problem that we're facing is that because of the Bush administration's counterterrorism policies over the last 6 years or 5 years, the U.S. has very dramatically lost credibility on the human rights front. And it's understandable why this happened. This is a government that says that waterboarding isn't torture. This is a government that until McCain pushed through his legislation a year ago, insisted that the prohibition on cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment didn't apply if you were a non-American outside the United States. A loophole that nobody had ever heard of until some brilliant lawyer in the Bush administration concocted it. This is the government that has been disappearing people into CIA secret detention facilities. It's the government that's view of a fair trial is one in which it's allowed to take evidence that has been coerced and introduce it at trial, and won't even let you cross-examine about it because it wants to classify the entire interrogation process as secret. You can't tell the terrorists about that. And that's, of course, the proposal for the military commissions, which is still on the books. So, these are the sorts of problems that we're encountering. And it's not just us in the United States who read about these things. And as you travel around the world, what you encounter is, people almost laugh when you discuss the Bush administration as being a potential proponent of human rights. And this is not just, anti-Americanism, which is obviously prevalent in many parts of the world, but when you even talk to, really die-hard American proponents, Europeans who are very transatlantic, who have, spent time here, lived here, been educated here, there's nothing anti-Americanism about this. There's just, they're confronting reality. The U.S. doesn't have credibility on this score. Now, there's some things that the U.S. still can credibly deal with. The U.S. doesn't massacre large numbers of people, so it can still be a proponent of human rights in, say, Darfur, trying to end the ethnic cleansing there. But, when it comes to a lot of the day-to-day abuses that we deal with, torture, detention without trial, disappearance, what's the United States going to do? I had an interesting experience recently in Egypt where, on the one hand, I went to the U.S. ambassador to Egypt. And I said, how is this affecting your promotion of human rights? Are you able to talk about torture, which is a huge problem in Egypt? Are you able to talk about their holding, thousands of Islamists, suspects without trial? And, he sort of sheepishly had to admit, no, can't talk about this. He'd be laughed at. I then met with the Egyptian prime minister. And, I'm not the U.S. government, so I can talk about these things, and I naturally brought them up. And his sort of cheap excuse, his cheap answer was, well, what do you want? That's what the United States does. Now, I want to stress this is a cheap excuse. It in no sense justifies it. But it's what governments can get away with to sort of fastly fend off this kind of criticism. So I'll come back to your question. Let me just finish up, and then I'll come back to questions. So, what do you do? Obviously, we were going to try to, redeem the United States as a credible proponent of human rights. The Democratic Congress may start in that direction, although I don't frankly have high hopes. I don't think we're going to really get to the point where we even theoretically can look to the United States for another couple of years. And even then, it's going to depend on, who is the president and to what extent will he or she really distance the U.S. government from these past practices, repudiate them, hold accountable those who've been responsible for them. So there's a lot that needs to be done. But in the interim, what we're left with is that the most important ally that traditionally the human rights movement has had to promote human rights is just not there for us. And what do we do? Well, we've started to look around the world and say, well, who might start filling that void? Now, there are a few governments out there that are eager to lead, but in the wrong direction. China, Russia. Unfortunately, this is not a laughing matter because China and Russia are both, increasingly assertive in their foreign policy. China for the longest time was just kind of, very much contained within itself. But as we all know, it's out there shopping mainly for energy resources. And it has a very explicit, no strings attached policy when it comes to dealing with other governments. Sudan has oil to sell. We're not going to ask about Darfur. Angola has oil. We're not going to deal with, the massive corruption. Zimbabwe, has natural resources. We're not going to deal with the fact that, Mugabe has declared war on his people. And so what you find is the Sudanese government really propping up, or the Chinese government propping up these highly abusive governments. In the case of Angola, for example, because of corruption, literally $4 billion disappeared over a 5-year period. just off into Swiss bank accounts or whatever. This was the equivalent of the entire social services budget of Angola, just gone. Now, the IMF, to its credit, went in there and said, we're willing to lend you some additional money if you open up your books, if you're more transparent. And China came in and said, we'll give you $2 billion with no strings attached. Guess which way Angola turned? Or Sudan right now. Now, I have to say, Sudan, China is beginning to turn a little bit. I mean, we've been putting a lot of pressure on China because of its tacit support for Darfur and the ethnic cleansing there. And, we've been asking, essentially, is the flow of oil more important than the flow of blood in Darfur? Does Beijing want to be known as the supporter of thugs and murderers around the world? And the truth of the matter is it doesn't. And so it's kind of bumping up into the limits of its no-strings-attached policy and is beginning to recognize that it's going to have to do something. Its Ambassador Wang at the UN has recently went to Addis Ababa and pushed the African Union to kind of be more effective on Darfur. Hu Jintao, the Chinese president, was just in Khartoum, and he at least talked with Sudanese President Bashir about the importance of letting the UN peacekeepers into Darfur. So they're doing little bits. But, are they threatening to cut off the oil revenue until China lets in the peacekeepers? No. They're not there. And short of that kind of strong economic pressure, it's not clear to me that we're going to have a solution in Darfur. So, China is a factor, but is basically a negative factor. Russia, more of the same. Russia doesn't quite have the global reach. But Putin, as I think we're all aware, is very much cracking down at home. I actually was just at a conference with him on this weekend in Munich. And he gave this speech you may have read about in the paper, decrying the emergence of a unipolar world, which was kind of his effort to revive the Cold War, and he was criticizing somewhat justifiably the United States for ignoring international law and basically doing what it wants. And so I asked him about the emergence of a unipolar government in Russia, because it has just cracked down on every competing center of influence. So it's the Duma, the regional governors, the media, the press, the NGOs, the business community, and that's where he's going, and he is eager to embrace others like him. So when, for example, Islam Karimov, the president of Uzbekistan, murdered hundreds of people in a demonstration in Andijan in May of 2005, the West immediately imposed. Putin invited him to his dacha outside of Moscow and embraced the guy. And he's sort of, the former Soviet Union may, particularly in Central Asia, have one dictator after another. That's fine with Putin. If he can kind of embrace these people and slowly kind of recreate some semblance of the former Soviet Union, so much the better. So, again, a very important counter effect to Western efforts to promote human rights. Now, there are, a number of democracies around the world that you could look to that might be able to step up and, fill in some of the gap from the United States. Let me run through a few of them before I get to the main set of democracies that we're looking to. You obviously have, places like Canada, fairly nearby, which have a long history of playing a decent role in human rights. Indeed, Canada was one of the lead governments in our efforts to create a landmines treaty a few years ago. Today, though, with Stephen Harper in the prime ministership, they are much more interested in good relations with the Bush administration than they are with promoting human rights. And so Human Rights Watch is in the middle of a new effort to create a treaty outlawing the use of cluster bombs and cluster munitions. Norway, which had been the other partner with Canada on the landmines treaty, has sponsored a conference later this month to launch this effort. Canada is not co-sponsoring it. In fact, Canada is not even showing up in support. It's going to show up in a kind of a neutral capacity as an observer, which just shows how far back they've come from being a real vigorous defender of human rights. Australia, similarly with the Howard government, has taken an almost identical position on a number of key human rights issues. South Africa is one of sort of the new emerging democracies of the global South. You would think that here it benefited from the global attention to apartheid, the international solidarity with the anti-apartheid movement, but no. Mbeki is there, absolutely refusing to criticize Mugabe in Zimbabwe. There was a recent effort at the UN to condemn Burma, and South Africa joined with China and Russia in blocking the effort. You got to say, what's going on here? There's sort of the sense, we got our support and now we're closing the door. No more of this. It's not all hopeless. I mean, there are governments like, say, Senegal and Ghana that periodically vote the right way in UN circles, but overall are still very kind of caught up in a regional perspective on these issues. They tend to support the African bloc, which overall is much more concerned with defending African governments than defending African people when their rights are violated. In Latin America, you do have a number of governments that have played a much more prominent and successful role, governments like Argentina, Chile, Mexico, and it's helpful. They often are voting, like a European government on human rights issues. But it's not enough to overcome, the combination of the U.S. failure and these broad arrays of governments that are really want to do anything but to support human rights enforcement. So with this panoply of sort of, mostly negative news, the set of governments that you would naturally look to play a supportive role would be the governments of the European Union. After all, here are 27 governments. The Union, while initially an economic bloc, is founded very much on principles of respect for democracy and human rights. In fact, to join the European Union, you've got to live up to those standards. And the accession process has been very important, historically for dealing with, say, Spain, Portugal, Greece, following their dictatorships. More recently in bringing in the former, Soviet bloc governments of Eastern Europe, and the prospect of joining the EU and getting the economic benefits that were entailed was a huge incentive for the human rights improvements that we've seen in all of these countries. So, this is kind of a natural coalition for human rights leadership. And if you're going to say, who will replace the United States in these dark days, the European Union is the natural candidate. That's the theory. The reality is something considerably short of that. Because the European Union is not, the United States of Europe. There is no single government there that can just kind of decide and then push forward. There are 27 sovereign governments, each of which is extremely reluctant to give up its prerogatives. And while, it's one thing to sort of allow the bureaucrats in Brussels to set, standards for this or that economic product or maybe, travel and so forth. When it comes to setting foreign policy, no one wants to give up their sovereign rights. And so the European Union will not achieve what's called a common position unless every one of those 27 members agrees. Unanimity is required. Everyone, even Malta, has a veto. This is a tough way to run foreign policy. It means that you are being led by your most reluctant member. That's, the bottom line. That becomes your common policy. It's the policy of the lowest common denominator. And as a result, Europe is punching well below its weight when it comes to projecting its influence on things like human rights around the world. Because either it doesn't act at all because it can't come up with a consensus, or the consensus that it arrives at is pretty weak, usually just a fizzle. Maybe a watered-down statement, but rarely the kind of tough economic or diplomatic pressure that is needed to get things done. So, if it's Germany and its reluctance to take a tough position toward Russia, or Greece's refusal to allow any kind of accommodation with Turkey, or France's refusal to push Tunisia, I mean, you can go on and on. There's always somebody who stands in the way of a strong common position. This is particularly a problem in a setting like the UN Human Rights Council. This is the new institution in Geneva to replace the discredited Human Rights Commission. And there is huge work to be done there. I mean, the Council is roughly divided evenly between the traditional supporters of human rights and the traditional opponents of human rights enforcement, with a series of swing votes, that'll basically decide whether a resolution gets through or not. In order to capture those swing votes and create a majority, you need a fast-moving, flexible diplomatic policy. But when the European Union shows up, God forbid that they, assign their few representatives on the Council, a broad task like get us a resolution on Darfur, do what it takes, or this is our broad policy on dealing with Uzbekistan, make something happen. You never get instructions like that. Instead, what you get is, we want to see the resolution, and they start editing word by word the proposed resolution. until they get consensus among 27 people on what each of those words should be, what the punctuation should be. By that point, the debate is long past where they were. And the EU becomes almost irrelevant to this process. It's impossible to build a majority in the kind of fast-paced environment of the Council with that kind of plodding decision-making process. Now, another problem with the European Union is the way it rotates leadership. Now, some of this rotation is understandable. I mean, the idea is, everybody is co-equal in the European Union. There's no one who's more equal than somebody else. And so everybody gets their turn to be president. And so every 6 months, there is a new president of the European Union. The presidency is what they call it. This 6 months, it happens to be Germany, it's a real country. Next 6 months, it'll be Portugal. Sometimes it's Luxembourg. And it's bad enough that you sometimes have governments that are completely, in over their head when it comes to running this complex body. But it's hard to think of a more inappropriate way to build expertise or a sustained sort of stick-with-it policy than this kind of, just this blur of new fresh faces every 6 months showing up to lead the European Union. Because, one thing you learn in the human rights business is you don't get things done unless you really do stick with it. Unless, the target government knows that you're going to be back in its face, month after month, year after year, until finally they relent. That's how you make progress. But here, first of all, you got a new set of people showing up. They got to figure out, what's going on. Where's Darfur? What are the issues? So they're getting themselves up to speed. Then, they finally learn what's going on. They got, 2-3 months left. Then they have to hand it over to somebody else who's got to start all over again. And even though there's some effort to kind of compensate for this, but they create these troikas where they will have the next president sort of sharing the burdens with the current president. And they'll have a European Commission guy in there to kind of help guide it along. The bottom line is the people in charge are new every 6 months. This is not a way to get things done. A much better procedure, you're never going to change the rotating presidency, but there's no reason consistent with that rotating presidency that you couldn't assign permanent troikas for important issues. So, you three over here, we're giving you Darfur. You're going to have Darfur for the next 6 years, not 6 months. And you're going to be the experts on it. You're going to be in Khartoum every month. They're going to be sick of you. But that's how we're going to move things in Darfur. That would be the way to get things done. They haven't done this yet. They're beginning to do this in other issues. They've just set up a permanent troika for Iran on the nuclear question. They've just set up a troika for Somalia and then the sort of whole mess there. But they don't do it yet on human rights issues, which is absolutely essential if they're ever going to sort of be effective in this area. To make matters worse, they're not achieving anything but, this minimalist common position. Then you go up to a government like, Germany or France and say, well, look, the common position may be pathetic, it may be down there, but you don't have to do only that. You could treat that as the bottom line. You could do more than that to promote human rights. But typically these governments say, no, the common position, that's not the floor, that's the ceiling. We're not going to do anything more than the common position. And it becomes this excuse, again, to basically do nothing. Again, nothing built into the, any inherent EU structure. It's just the way they choose to interpret this. Then, finally, to make matters still worse, they do all of this common policy stuff behind closed doors in Brussels, so nobody knows it's happening. Our Brussels office, spends tons of time on the phone just trying to figure out who's doing what, what's on the agenda, what's being decided. And this is by design because, it's often inconvenient to promote human rights. And you got to give up the next contract or you got to give up, the base that you were hoping to set up in that country. I mean, there always are costs involved. It's never a free process. Governments don't like to spend that, to bear that cost. And so they like to sort of sneak these decisions through. That's why there's no transparency. But if you opened it up, if the public saw what was happening, they'd be much more likely to insist on a strong human rights policy. But of course, that's not what the governments want. And so, it's a fairly untransparent process. This is the democracy deficit that people often talk about in Brussels. Now, these are not just theoretical issues. If you look at sort of the big challenges facing the EU as well as the world, the EU is failing miserably. Russia right now is a huge challenge. The EU almost refuses to talk about human rights in Russia. because it is terrified that Russia will shut off the gas. And Russia, frankly, does sometimes shut off the gas. It did it recently to Belarus. It did it a year ago to Ukraine. It's done it to Georgia. Putin is perfectly willing to use the gas to get what he wants politically. Now, what I've been arguing to Merkel and to others is that I understand Europe's interest in energy security, but you should recognize that an arbitrary dictator does not make us a good business partner. This is precisely the kind of guy who's going to shut off the gas because he has no restraints on him, whether it's the rule of law or democracy, because he shut them all down. This is an unaccountable government, and unaccountable governments make poor business partners. So it should be in your long-term interest to push human rights and to improve and make Russia more accountable. They get this conceptually, but to get the EU to agree to something like this is a huge uphill struggle, which we're engaged in. Same thing with China, where everybody's competing for contracts. They all remember what happened to little Denmark when Denmark sort of said too much about human rights in China, and China just stopped dealing with Denmark. The way, obviously, to avoid that kind of stuff is safety in numbers. You have a common policy. But, to get 27 governments to agree on a tough position on China is extraordinarily difficult. Even to kind of push China to do the right thing in Darfur, to kind of cut off the oil revenue in Darfur until Khartoum lets the peacekeepers in to stop the killing, even that Europe has not been able to do in any kind of systematic or tough fashion. And of course, when it comes to something like, speaking about human rights abuses in the United States, which should be on Europe's agenda, they have a really hard time doing that. I mean, they finally got around to saying, why don't you close Guantanamo? But they are offering no assistance in kind of resettling even the detainees that the U.S. wants to release from Guantanamo. They're willing to protest the CIA flights to secret detention facilities, but they are making it extremely difficult to find out what complicity there was locally with these flights. What did the Italian government really know when the guy was kidnapped off the streets of Milan? Was the German government really complicit in this guy who was kidnapped out of Macedonia? On and on. I mean, you get hints of this. Did Poland really allow the CIA to set up a secret detention facility on its soil? They don't want to say. And so, when push comes to shove, again, you get a very weak policy, and it's a tough time coming up with, with something, some kind of supermajority common policy rather than a unanimous policy that might allow for a bit of a tougher stand. So I'm going to stop here because I want to allow some time for questions. But let me just wrap up by saying I don't pretend that the EU is a panacea to this leadership problem. But there is a real leadership void out there left by the Bush administration's human rights conduct. It is one that we need filled by somebody if we are going to continue to effectively promote human rights around the world beyond simply the ability of shaming to do its magic. And the EU is the obvious candidate here, but we've got a lot of work to do to make the EU live up to its potential and to begin to punch at its weight rather than below it. So thank you, and I'd welcome your questions. Yes.
I can't wait for the
I can't wait for the microphone.
I can. We have a bit of a history together.
Yes.
The guy I worked for, Kenan Makia, and one of the people who worked for you, Andrew Whitley, got some Saddam documents out in '91, and
18 tons of them.
18 tons,
Yes.
Along with the Kurds and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And you made Iraq the centerpiece of your work in the '90s. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you know your organization was one of the many organizations that estimates that Saddam was responsible for the killing of 2 to 5 million people.
No. That's not the number. I mean, it was about 100,000 in the genocide.
Not just in Fad. I'm talking about throughout the regime of the.
Well, throughout the regime, I mean, civilians. It would be about 300,000. More people obviously died in the Iran-Iraq War. Well, but I think it's important not to sort of exaggerate these numbers.
There's the Iran-Iraq War.
Yeah.
There's the mass graves, genocidal campaigns. You, among others, and I've worked on some of the documents, been working on the documents since '91. Estimates are ranged between 2 to 5 million people. As I'm sure you're aware, Max van der Stoel, the UN Special Rapporteur, he, throughout his great reports every 6 months, he said that the human rights violations were unprecedented since the World War II. Another little bit about the documents. I'm sure you're aware of the documents that you worked on and one I worked on. estimates are based on detainees, executioners, and former guards. Executions range from 500 to 1,000 a day. So I wonder if you would applaud the United States for toppling that regime.
Okay. Well, first of all, I mean, some of these facts are disputed because I honestly, Saddam's worst crime was the Anfal genocide of 1988, in which, up to 100,000 people were killed. 182. Okay, I know they're different numbers, but but even if it's 182, we're not talking with 2 to 5 million. I mean, obviously, this is excluding soldiers who died in the Iran-Iraq War, which is a different matter. But in terms of civilians, we're probably talking about up to about 300,000 total. Maybe give and take a little bit. That's terrible. I mean, in no sense am I, defending that. Indeed, I spent about 2 years trying to get Saddam prosecuted for those offenses. But I do think it's important not to exaggerate. I mean, 800,000 died in the Rwandan genocide. 2 million probably died under Pol Pot. I mean, there are other big crimes out there. Saddam's was a big crime. The question comes up, can you justify the invasion of Iraq as a humanitarian intervention? And while that's a complicated issue, and indeed I've written on this and would welcome people to kind of look at our website, it's there. To sum up, I think that the first criterion you have to meet before anything else, in my view, is that you can't justify the extreme resort to military force absent a situation in which it's necessary to stop ongoing or imminent mass slaughter. And while I think you could easily have justified military intervention, say in 1988, to stop the Anfal genocide, you could have probably justified it in 1991 to stop the suppression of the uprisings then. In March 2003, there was no killing of that magnitude or anywhere near it going on. And I don't believe you can justify the use of military force simply to punish past killing. You need some kind of ongoing or imminent killing. And that killing of that magnitude simply wasn't happening. So for that reason alone, I don't think you can justify the invasion as a humanitarian intervention. There are other factors as well, which I lay out in the article, but I won't get into them now just because we're sort of short on time. Yes?
Has your organization adopted any position about the current Iranian government and any possible human rights abuses that they've engaged in?
Well, more than possible. I mean, they've engaged in a lot of human rights abuses. This is a
what is your organization's view on that? What are you doing about that?
Well, we're reporting on it extensively. I mean, again, I'd welcome everybody. Our website is www.hrw.org. And it's very easy to navigate because you can just go country by country. So if you click on Iran, you can see all the reports we've done. To sum up, Iran was actually going somewhat in the right direction under the Khatami government. And since the arrival of Ahmadinejad, it's been going backwards quickly. And so, what still remains a relatively vigorous civil society for the Middle East is still being significantly constrained. You find, newspapers being shut down, journalists being arrested. There is no local human rights group that's able to function. There is a very deliberate effort to limit public debate.
Did you have that same outrage over the Iranian government as you seem to have over President Bush and Guantanamo Bay?
I think the Iranian government is clearly going in the wrong direction. It uses torture. It uses political imprisonment by all means. Again, look at our reports on this. We've reported on this extensively.
Just curious.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Just to switch topics a little bit, what do you think the UN High Commission on Human Rights can do to improve human rights situations around the world, or how do you give that body more power just to, actually have some teeth and not just make sort of blanket condemnations of countries?
But are you referring to the UN Human Rights Council, the new body? Yeah. Well, first of all, I would not minimize at all the significance of its resolutions. I mean, governments do somersaults to try to avoid being condemned by the council or the old commission. China, which in the end was never even condemned, but just the prospect of being condemned led it to launch these massive diplomatic offenses and to actually make various concessions as a way of trying to head off a potential resolution. So governments hate this. In fact, part of the problem with the old commission is that governments were so scared of being condemned by the commission that you would have these highly abusive governments that would flock to the Commission in order to undermine its work. And one of the things we tried to accomplish with the new council was to change the membership rules somewhat to make it harder for the thugs to get on the thing. We didn't completely succeed. But it's a little bit better than the old Commission. But so I still think that the country resolutions, the condemnations, are extremely important. But they're, in a sense, that's the last resort. There are lots of things you can do before that. There's the whole special rapporteur system that can get into a country, that can investigate and expose and engage in dialogue with the government and push it. You can sometimes offer technical assistance, which I think is only appropriate with governments that show some political will to respect human rights. Too often governments say, oh, yeah, sure, give me a few trainers as a way of avoiding any real pressure. So you don't want to avoid using it in those circumstances. But I think that the whole UN process, including Louise Arbour's office, is a very good way of establishing some level of protection. If you put a bunch of human rights monitors on the ground, their mere presence is a deterrent to abuse. So I think all these mechanisms are tools that should be used. And then you do want, as a last resort, condemnation. Obviously, if that doesn't work, then you go to the Security Council and you try more more coercive measures. Yes.
We have a question from upstairs from our overflow room.
Yes.
It states that Leslie Thunberg, an activist who spoke at CASE on Friday last week, said that the media only really focus on human rights violations when the U.S. wants to go at war with somebody. What's your opinion on this assertion?
Oh, I mean, I don't think that's true. In others, the suggestion is that we only noticed human rights in Iraq when we were about to go to a war with Iraq, and now we're only noticing human rights in Iran because Bush is threatening there. I mean, no. Darfur. It took a while to get Darfur on the agenda, but people certainly focus on human rights abuses in Darfur. And if anything, the Western militaries are running away from Darfur. We're trying to get them to go in there with peacekeepers, and they're saying no, anything but. If it comes to human rights in Russia or China, which clearly are getting a lot of attention, nobody's going to invade those countries. A place like Colombia, which has gotten in this hemisphere a lot of attention. There's a war going on, but nobody from the outside is going to invade. Cuba, again, it's not a realistic threat. I mean, you can just go on and on. So no, I mean, the press certainly reports more widely, and obviously a group like Human Rights Watch, which works regularly in about 70 countries, we report way more widely. So, I'm the first to complain that the press doesn't do enough. And one of the things we always try to do is to get the press to do more. But I wouldn't be so cynical as to say that they just report on the places the U.S. wants to invade. Yes.
Do you think even if the EU or Canada takes the human rights leadership, that as long as the U.S. continues with their human rights abuses, that it's going to be hard for the Human Rights Watch to really enforce anything against Iran or against other countries, as long as they can point saying that the U.S. is also doing these abuses, and so maybe we should start pressuring the U.S. I know you're pressuring it now, and continue to pressure them to stop these human rights abuses.
Yeah, there is something unique about the United States, just as the superpower, as the most influential government around. If your typical government commits a human rights violation, you say, well, that's a violation, but you never feel that the standards themselves are jeopardized. When the U.S. commits a violation, it degrades the standard. And that's just a product of U.S. influence. So you may still have a law there that says, thou shalt never torture. But if the U.S. is torturing, other governments are going to pay much less attention to that law. That's just the reality of the superpower. So that is, the question about, why are we so fixated on the United States? I mean, part of it, the abuses are important in and of themselves. But second, there is a demonstration effect to U.S. conduct, which is severe. And has hurt us around the world and hurt the standards that we try to enforce. Yeah.
In view of the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories, the collective punishment that takes place there, and lately the construction of this wall that separates people from their fields, students from their schools, and individuals from doctors and hospitals. I know you've criticized the war in Lebanon on both sides. Has there been criticism of the Israeli government in order to stop these practices?
No, absolutely. I mean, again, I won't have time to go into it in any depth, but I just refer you to our website. But, say, for example, on the wall, in my view, Israel has a right to build a wall as a way of fighting suicide bombing as long as it puts it on the Green Line. But to put it into occupied territory is a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Similarly, Israel has every right to punish people who are engaged in violence against it. But to destroy an entire family's home just because one of its members committed a crime is an act of collective punishment. And I could go on, but we've reported on all this and much, much more. And by the flip token, we've reported on Palestinian abuses. So, we kind of wrote by far the most in-depth account looking at suicide bombing, explaining what was wrong with it, and identifying the groups and the individuals that bore personal responsibility. So, but I don't want time to get into all that, but I, again, refer you to the website. Let me, I guess, well, let's go back here and then we'll come back down. Yeah, right up there.
I don't know if this is within the scope of... Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if this is within the scope of what you wanted to talk about today, but I was wondering if you've ever felt personally threatened in some country just because you're with Human Rights Watch, if you've ever been in personal danger.
Yes. I suppose, usually if you're in sort of, if you're in a nice dictatorship, those, those are situations where you tend to be okay. It's in the kind of more chaotic situations, war zones and the like, where it's tougher. I think the two hairiest situations I've ever been in, one was, I was in Haiti when the army decided to shut down an election by just killing as many people as they could find. And that was a little dicey. And another time I was in Rwanda, and there had just been a massacre. And we heard about the massacre, and we drove out to the middle of nowhere, this field, really, really kind of no place, and interviewed a few of the survivors. And as we were leaving, bumped into the patrol that had clearly just committed the massacre, and had this standoff on the hill, for about an hour and a half, until we finally just kind of talked our way out of it. So, it's things like that are a little dicey. But, for the most part, if you're in a situation where the government is in control, being from Human Rights Watch actually helps rather than hurts, because there would be such consequence to the government were they to attack one of our people. And we also are very careful. We try not to put our people in situations where they are endangered. And while you can't ever avoid that, everybody knows the risks involved, we do take a number of precautions to minimize that. And so far we've been lucky. So far the worst that's happened has been people have been, roughed up a little bit or arrested or expelled, but, nothing beyond that. Yes.
So there'll be one more question after this.
Okay. You said that when the U.S. commits a human rights abuse, it degrades the standard so that other people think it's okay. What I want to know is simply, how can the United States improve its own human rights policy so as to be a better example for the rest of the world and thereby fill the void as you have described it?
Yeah. Well, excellent question. And I think that, the major areas I would focus on would be, coercive interrogation, disappearances, and detention without trial. Now, there has been some progress. Obviously Bush, at least temporarily, has shut down the secret detention facilities, although there still are some big questions. We're going to be putting a report out in a few days identifying a number of people who are still disappeared and unaccounted for. And we suspect that they're being held not by the United States formally, but by some proxy government. There's, on coercive interrogation, there's been progress there in that the Pentagon has actually pulled the military out of the business of coercive interrogation. If you look at the new Army Field Manual on Intelligence Interrogation that was adopted in September, it's a very good document. And the problem today is not so much the military as it is the CIA, where Bush continues to, play games with the rules that apply there. Arbitrary detention, we still have a big problem. The Bush administration still claims the right to declare any non-American an enemy combatant, and on its own unilateral say-so to detain that person until the end of their life without ever seeing a judge.
Even Americans?
Well, they theoretically, with Americans, if it's in the United States, they can call you an enemy combatant, but they at least concede you can see a judge. And with the rest of the world, they don't even show you the judge, necessarily. So these are, that has to end. There clearly is a role for treating people as combatants on a war zone, but if you treat the entire world as a war zone and allow the Bush administration to unilaterally declare anybody an enemy combatant, the effect is that you can take all of human rights law, all criminal justice rights we thought we had, and throw them out the window. So, these are big threats. I think we're making progress, but there's a significant way to go. But it's a matter of ending those abuses, genuinely repudiating them, and ideally, holding people accountable for torture. That's what's going to change things.
One last question.
You commented that governments that are not accountable make bad business partners in the long term. Could you expand on that?
Yeah.
Because it seems to me there's a sort of undercurrent that human rights should be protected, but governments keep deciding not to, and there must be some reason they're doing that. And how do we counter that understanding?
Yeah, I think the reason is usually short-term expediency. But I guess my assumption is that to be a reliable business partner, you want a government that is subject to the rule of law foremost. So they can't just rip up a contract, at will. And ideally, I think governments tend to be more responsive, more responsible if they are checked by an independent press, by an independent civil society, people who are commenting on their behavior. When you have surrounded yourself with sycophants because you've silenced everybody else, you tend to act badly. And I don't think governments are so different from people in that respect. So if Europe really wants Russia to be a reliable partner, it should be promoting the rule of law in Russia, and it should be promoting democratic governance. And while there are short-term reasons not to do that because, they want the energy right now, and they're worried about the gas being shut off tomorrow, the truth is Russia needs to sell the stuff anyhow. So I think the threat of a cutoff is somewhat exaggerated. But I don't think you're going to find a reliable partner in any number of spheres, whether it's commercial, energy, security, you name it, until you start dealing with these underlying human rights problems.
Now, before we adjourn, I do have a gift on behalf of Dean Simpson and the law school and myself for you. It says, with appreciation, Kenneth Roth, the Klatsky Seminar on Human Rights, Frederick K. Cox International Law Center, February 12, 2007. Hopefully you'll put that on your mantle and remember us. Thank you.